which is good Zoom protocol. Do you want me to just send you the file really quick, or do you want to share access? I mean, I can explain what I'm in, just one kind of image to kind of give us an idea of what we're doing.
Yeah, no, I actually did not intend to have screen share disabled. And if I could figure out the settings where I could change that. Yeah, hang on.
He's on Zoom in class. Do you want to talk to him? Let's tell him the next time he gets down to 10 days.
So while you are looking at that, if you don't mind, I'll get started this way. We don't wait. Don't want to keep people past 9 if they've got things to do. I don't know, maybe got other Zoom studies or things to work on. So when Richard contacted me, and I was kind of hard to get in touch with at first, so I apologize for that. Oh, there we go. We might be able to get it now. Let's see. Screen share. Oh man, I have unlimited power. He has made me the host. All right.
We're at your mercy.
Oh no, it's terrible, terrible. Really only got one.
Big mistake, Rick. Big mistake.
Look at in particular. But I was looking at is that showing for you guys?
Yep. Okay.
So I was looking at, I asked and he provided a really useful list to look at some of the Psalms that you'd looked at so far. And, there's this big argument and discussion about how exactly to, determine what Psalms are what. But I noticed that, you've gone through a fair number of praise Psalms like 8 and 29 and 113. And then understandably a bunch of laments, probably something we've been thinking about a lot in terms of like 22 or 90 or 109. Even some royal psalms, some Torah psalms, one trust psalm, one imprecatory psalm, but you hadn't really gone too much over Thanksgiving psalms. And one of the possibilities I gave him was 65, and whether he was thinking about the being 'tis the season, or if it was just kind of picked 65 out of the top of the hat, as it were. I thought it'd be useful for us to just real quickly think about what's going on, and then we'll transition more to kind of a class idea of what's going on here, is what Thanksgiving Psalms are. Like, what are we expecting when we open that up? And kind of what we can think about in the Psalms, and this is pretty universal when you're reading through the Psalms, is that if you look at this white box that I gave you guys, this is a representation of just a crisis, a bad thing that happens. Now, the crisis can be all sorts of different things. We can have an individual crisis, like David's running from his enemies or running from Saul. It could be a national crisis, like a famine or being under attack by Assyria or Babylon, or there not being a king, like there is in, say, Psalm 89. But this relationship to crisis has a lot to do with the type of psalm that you're reading. So, for example, if you're in the midst of crisis, these are the lament psalms. And when we're stuck deep in dangers and sorrows, when it's sickness or death or the loss of a job or the hurt of a friend or lack of faith in God, whatever that crisis is, these laments kind of cry out to God and show us that, look, it's okay to have some hard times. God wants us to call out to him and to lay our souls bare to him and allow him to kind of take those burdens from us. You've looked at a lot of those. Well, Thanksgiving Psalms aren't right there. Then you can kind of have one step forward from the lament Psalms, and that's these Psalms of trust. And in Psalms of trust, you are still in the thick of it, right? You're still in the midst of crisis. You're still in the midst of this difficulty, but it's kind of a step beyond lament. The panic and the fear, the my God, why have you forsaken me sort of language we've moved past a little bit about that. And we get things like in Psalm 27, which I know you guys studied, though an army besiege me, my heart will not fear. Though war break out against me, even then I'll be confident. You're still stuck in the crisis, but your faith and your trust and your confidence as God has conquered that fear, and it's going to bring you out of it. It's like Psalm 23, which, for good reason, follows Psalm 22, right? From my God, why have you forsaken me, to even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. For you are with me, your rod and your staff, they comfort me. So there's a progression that goes on from lament to trust. And then, of course, even though the crisis remains, you're kind of peeking out of it. And it's after the crisis has ended, that's when we're going to get into the Psalms that we're looking at. And of course, we could look at Psalm 24 as an example of one of these as well. 22, 23, 24 kind of arranged really nicely like that. But what's going to happen here is when you do the things for God that you told him that you were going to do, right? Now the thing has happened, the oaths that you've taken, the crisis has passed, and now that vow that you've taken, that, you know, we see a lot of times David say, you know, if you do this for me, then I'm going to go and praise you in the midst of the congregation, or I'll, you know, do this, or I'll do whatever. That's what we're going to get from these sorts of Psalms. He's going to go to the temple. He's going to praise the name of the Lord. He's going to make his offerings. And this is pretty crucial because everybody around him is going to know this is God who did this, not David. So I'm going to stop sharing so that you guys can see a bigger version of people's faces. This just, I think, at least for me, is a helpful way to kind of look at and think about what's going on. I'm going to pass Richard back the power so he can admit people as they come in and such as that. Look at that. Yeah, I have the power. You're the He-Man of the Zoom Bible study. But we have these kind of ideas played out then in that way. And that's kind of what I want us to have in our minds as we dive into Psalm 65, is to just kind of think about how this relates to some of the other Psalms that you guys have looked at and studied, and to think about how that's going to play out in general. So, questions up to this point? I'm trying to scan everybody's faces. Okay, good. All right, making sure I hadn't missed something. So what I want to do is for us to read through, it's a short psalm, all of Psalm 65 first, and then we'll kind of dive into its three major sections. But I like having the whole thing in the back of our minds. I'm sure most of you guys have read this before, maybe even, you know, today in preparation for this. But in case you haven't had that chance, I think it's a useful thing to do. Can I pick on someone in to read Psalm 65 for me?
I'll read.
Go ahead. Thanks, Daryl.
There will be silence before you, and praise in Zion, O God. And to you the vow will be performed, O you who hear prayer. To you all men come. Iniquities prevail against me. As for our transgressions, you forgive them. How blessed is the one whom you choose and bring near to you, to dwell in your courts. We will be satisfied with the goodness of your house, your holy temple. By awesome deeds you answer us in righteousness, O God of our salvation. You who are the trust of all the ends of the earth and of the farthest sea, who established the mountains by his strength, being girded with might, who stills the roaring of the seas, the roaring of their waves, and the tumult of the peoples. And they who dwell on the ends of the earth stand in awe of your signs. You make the dawn and the sunset shout for joy. You visit the earth and cause it to overflow. You greatly enrich it. The stream of God is full of water. You prepare their grain, for thus you prepare the earth. You water its furrows abundantly. You settle its ridges. You soften it with showers. You bless its growth. You've crowned the year with your bounty, and your paths drip with fatness. The pastures of the wilderness drip, and the hills gird themselves with rejoicing. The meadows are clothed with flocks, and the valleys are covered with grain. They shout for joy. Yes, they sing.
Okay, so we get right away this kind of overwhelming imagery of thanks and of the problem. So let's kind of pick out those issues at first. So what is the problem? Like, what's the crisis that has passed for David here? Yeah, is that a hand up, Gordon?
Go ahead, Gordon.
I'm just wondering if this need be a psalm that's dealing with any kind of crisis. It sounds more like a festival type psalm, a psalm of thanksgiving following the gathering of the harvest or a portion of the harvest in the fall. The rains have already come. The grain is still standing in the field. So it looks to me like more of a celebration of a festival than anything else. Perhaps I'm missing something here.
No. I think it's exactly right. That's what we'd expect in a Thanksgiving psalm, is the crisis has passed. And we see, like you said, the grain's already in the field. And I think that gives us an idea to how that plays out. But one thing that may help us kind of key in on some of those images is look at what he says at the very beginning, right? Praise is due you, or all silence will keep praise. We'll talk about that in a second. I'm not sure what version. Maybe Daryl was reading from the New American Standard. I think
That's it.
deals with that way. And to you vows will be performed. To you vows will be performed. Now here we have this imagery. Well, what does this mean? Vows will be performed. Well, if we look through the Bible, we can see a lot of these images. So in Psalm 116, verse 14, I will pay my vows to the Lord in the presence of all of his people. And there in Psalm 116, it's when you save me, or if you save me. Or, Proverbs 7:14, I had to offer sacrifices. Today I paid my vows. If we think about on the other side, Psalm 50, verse 14, random that these were all verse 14. I don't think there's anything of significance there, but it did make them easy to remember, is that offer to God a sacrifice of thanksgiving and perform your vows to the Most High. Or Psalm 107, verse 22, and let them offer sacrifices of thanksgiving and tell of his deeds in songs of joy. So you're exactly right. We are in the harvest now. And here we have the psalmist thanking God. But when you're paying your vows, well, that's because it's related to a crisis that he's brought you through. And he's not super specific about it. You're right. And that's because the focus is overwhelmingly on this thanksgiving, this praise, the harvest imagery that we do have through. So I think you're exactly right, actually, about that. And one of the interesting things about this is we don't have a lot of information about what crisis it was. We can kind of sometimes read between the lines, and you always got to be careful doing this. But if the answer to the prayer is harvest, most likely the crisis was what?
The possibility of a famine.
Yeah. Stephen, is that a hand up?
Yeah, so my thought is that this might have been for the Feast of Tabernacles, which is coming at harvest time. And also the water imagery in this is the Feast of Tabernacles was also the end of the dry season and coming into the rainy season. And so you would have the water imagery there. I think especially living in California where we have a wet season and a dry season, I understand this a bit, is you're very glad when that wet season finally comes and you're having rain again. And that there's a lot of water imagery in the Feast of Tabernacles. And so tying that in, I think that's a possibility.
Absolutely. That's going to be a big deal, especially when you're reading John, waters of life and everything else coming there for the Feast of Tabernacles. So a really good point to make there. And just because I can see y'all's first names, I'm just going to call you by your first name. If you want to be called by your last name, I will do that as well. John's just John, though. He didn't get a last name. But we have here is this problem with drought. Now, you'd mentioned, living in California or anywhere in the American West the past few years, we're very used to those sorts of drought warnings. Even a bigger deal in Israel and really that part of the Mediterranean world in general, it is the fancy scientific term is high interannual variability of rainfall. If you want to get, fancy or something like that. But it just means there's a bunch of famines. I mean, think about it. How often in the Bible are we reading there's a famine in the land? It's all over the place, right? I mean, think about the beginning of Ruth. They're leaving the land. Why? Yeah, there's a famine. I can read Kathleen's lips. Abraham gets into the land for all of a second and a half, right? In Genesis chapter 12. And immediately it's like, God's like, hey, no, stay in this land. But there's a problem. And what's the problem in Genesis 12, the second part of there? Yeah, like
Famine.
there's a famine. And where does he go? It's like pop quiz, right?
He goes to Egypt.
He goes to Egypt. That's not where he's supposed to go. He's supposed to stay in the land, right? He's supposed to have faith in that. If you leave the land because there's a famine in Genesis, always a bad thing, right? Abraham, of course, gets another shot at this a few chapters later in chapter 20. There's another famine in the land. He's like, I won't go to Egypt. I'm going to go to Geshur. And then Isaac, of course, in chapter 26 is like, that was a great idea. There's another famine in the land. I'm going to leave again. It never goes well, right? Because they're not supposed to leave the land. They're supposed to have faith in God. Of course, the fun thing about this is that who's the worst patriarch of them all in a lot of ways? It's Jacob, right? And yet he's the one patriarch who in the midst of a famine, right? Why are they going to go down to Joseph? Because there's a famine. But he's the only one who actually stops and asks God, am I supposed to leave or not? But here you have 3 patriarchs, and you've already got, what is it? 2 for Abraham, 1 for Isaac, 1 for Jacob, and the one for Jacob is really 4 famines for 3 patriarchs. Pretty common thing. Of course, when we get into the rest of Israel's history, if you read the curses and blessings in Deuteronomy 28 and the related passages in Leviticus, then God says, if you're doing the wrong thing, if you're worshiping idols, if you're sinning, then I'm going to give you famines. Now, I know you guys have read through, Joshua and Judges and 1st, 2nd Samuel. How often are the people, I don't know, worshiping idols? Yeah.
Frequently.
Yeah, it's shorter time to say when are they not, right? But so we expect to have these sorts of famines. And although it's probably likely that this psalm has been kind of retooled from David's original psalm, David himself experiences a famine. You remember at the end of 2 Samuel, where we get the description about the buying of the Temple Mount there on Mount Moriah, even if you had to read in Chronicles to find out it's called Mount Moriah, is that there's a famine in the land, right? That we have that there in verse 21, and then he doesn't want it again, a 3-year famine in 24. But so we have these famines going on here, and what's happened, it seems like, at least reading between the lines, and again, y'all do however much of that you want to do, but this is the problem that's been brought about, is that there was a famine, and that now God has completely taken care of things. This harvest isn't just a normal harvest. It is abundant. It is fruitful. It is incredible. It is more than they could possibly need. And of course, that's kind of what God does, right? Is he does, if we're reading, Micah or Malachi or something, he's going to open the gates, the rain floodgates. There we go. I was working for the right word there, of heaven, in order to shower his blessings upon them. And David has recognized it, and all of Israel singing this psalm have recognized it, that this gratitude has opened the door to their own souls to the world around them, and forcing us to look away from ourselves and look to God. That this idea of gratitude is something that should seek to bring us to look to something greater than ourselves. And that's really where the focus of the psalm is going to be, is on God and on his creation. That really is what we should expect it to do. So when Daryl was reading, and then he said he was reading the New American Standard Version, in Psalm 65, verse 1, Daryl, could you read that one more time for me? And those of you who have New American Standards, you'll notice what's going on here.
Sure. There will be silence before you, and praise in Zion, O God, and to you the vow will be performed.
Yeah. Now, does someone have a different version or something different than that? There. Stephen, is that a hand up?
So the ESV is praise is due to you, O God, in Zion, and to you shall vows be performed.
Yeah, so these are kind of these 2 ways of doing it. I think the King James Version kind of splits the difference a little bit. I don't know if anybody's reading that. I think the New International Version reads a little bit more like the ESV does. But these are 2 pretty different ideas. Anybody have any idea of what's going on with that?
Well, I just think it's interesting that the old American Standard Version doesn't read like the New American Standard.
Yeah, how's the ASV read, Richard?
Praise waiteth for thee, O God, and unto
Yeah.
thee shall thou be performed.
Yeah. So we have this is one of these fun flips. It's always fun when there's a kind of a weird contested reading and then like the new committee comes, like the New American Standard, they're like, nope, we're changing that one. Don't like that. How that works. But this is one of these times where the Hebrew is really, really confusing. And so some of the translators are looking at that and are like, I have no clue what that means. And so they actually read the Greek text, the Septuagint, and it's the one that says, praise is due you, O God in Zion. Whereas the Hebrew text has something to do with silence. Exactly what that means and how that plays out is kind of one of these strange things that translators are forced having to deal with that in that way. So I figured, if you'd ever wondered why that's bizarre, that gives you a little bit of an equal stance. But ultimately, they're both kind of talking about the same thing in terms of how they do it. Remember when the people of Israel have been rescued out of Egypt and they're standing at the edge of the Red/Reed Sea and they're complaining and whining because that's what they do. And do you remember what Moses says to them? What does he say, Kathleen?
Does he say wait and see?
Wait and see. All you have to do is be silent, right? In other words, God's already rescued them out of slavery. He's going to give them what they need in that. And of course, right after the Red Sea is when they do sing the praises to God. So these elements are often related. All the earth will keep silence before him will ultimately lead to praise. And that's kind of where this psalm is going to go as well. But he does talk about performing his vows. But there's an interesting thing how he talks about and who's going to be involved in these paying of vows in verse 2, which is who is supposed to be kind of coming to God here.
All men should be coming to God.
All men. Now, this is interesting. Does anybody's version read something a little bit different than all men there in verse 2?
My footnote says all flesh.
All flesh. Some versions read, I think that Stephen's reading the ESV, he'd say all flesh. That may ring the door, kind of the bells on our ears a little bit better. All flesh or all men is not just Israel. It means everybody. Now, that's a little strange in some ways, right? Because who would we expect on, the first glance at first to be rejoicing at Israel having a festival, if Gordon's right, and I think there's a lot to be said for that, or an Israelite rainy season, as Stephen has noted. Why is all mankind, all humankind, all flesh supposed to be coming to God because of this?
And Thanksgiving.
And Thanksgiving, but at first that doesn't seem like something that's benefiting all flesh, right?
Rain would.
Rain would, right?
If you weren't eating, it would.
Yeah, if it's raining on the just as well as the unjust, as it were, right? And that certainly could be something like what we saw with the famine for Joseph, that it's not just the famine there of Israel, but of kind of the entire world. But we do see this as a specific, not just Israel, but the peoples as well. So we get the all flesh, right? And this is the same word, dies in the flood in Genesis chapter 7, verse 21. And all flesh that goes onto the ark is what's going to be saved. But there's a problem that a lot of time Israel seems to forget, and that is that God is not just the God of Israel. Jeremiah says it this way. If anybody can flip over to Jeremiah chapter 32, verse 27, Jeremiah 32, verse 27, and you want to read that for me.
Behold, am I muted? Behold,
good.
I am the Lord, the God of all flesh. Is anything too hard for me?
Yeah. And in the midst of this chapter of Jeremiah is God's actually bringing Nebuchadnezzar to destroy Jerusalem. And they're like, oh, our God must not be as powerful as the God of the Babylonians. And God says, no, I'm the God of everything and everybody. Now, this, of course, is kind of, we now reading this, with our New Testament eyes on, is kind of a huge deal, because this is exactly what God has done. His plan from the beginning, right, is to bring all flesh, all peoples, not just Israel, to here. And it seems as though David at least has some sort of a glimpse, like sometimes Abraham or Moses or David does, about something that's going on, is that God's going to bring all people to him, not just Israel, that all people, all flesh is going to praise what God does. And that's in spite of the fact that these seem to be aimed in some ways against David. Yeah, Richard.
Is it and this is probably an obvious answer, but is it a general biblical concept in the Old Testament that God hears the prayers of Gentiles as well as Jews?
Yeah, I know that this is sometimes debated, but God's pretty clear about it. The easiest example of that is in the temple dedication. And then I saw Gordon's hand up, so I'll give it to him in a second. But God explicitly says in the temple dedication there in 1 Kings chapter 1, that if all peoples will come to this place and pray, I'll answer their prayers, which seems pretty cut and dried to me. But Gordon, did you have a hand up, I think?
Yes, I was just looking at the structure of this early part of the psalm. It looks like it could be two different kinds of parallelism. In the first verse, our praises are due to you, followed by the line, we will pay our vows to you, as though these are synonymous lines.
Mm-hmm.
The praises that are due are the vows we will pay, but it is in Zion that this is to be paid. Then do we not have something very nearly resembling an antithetical line when we come to the second verse, that all flesh or all nations or all people shall come to you? It isn't just limited to those of us here in David's stronghold.
Yes, absolutely. It goes from particular to universal. I think you're exactly right about that. So that's a really good way to put it, looking even in the parallelism of the structure and how it plays out. So we have him here say, when iniquities prevail against me, you atone for our transgressions. There's always this melding in the Psalms, and I would suggest throughout the Bible, of individual sin and communal sin. It's like when the apostles come to Jesus in John 9, who sinned, this man or his father, that he was born blind? And you're like, what do you mean? Because we don't tend to think of blindness, right, as because of sin, but they tended to do so. And there's a lot of texts that would exemplify this. It's the same sort of thing that Isaiah does in Isaiah 6, that famous passage when he kind of comes and sees God. He says, woe is me, I'm a man of unclean lips, and I come from a people of unclean lips. That sin is catching in a way, although that's kind of a weird idea to us in our very modern, very Western, hyper-individualized culture. But we kind of see that played out a little bit here. And yet we have him discuss about God's blessings being played out. God, by the end of this psalm, David's going to be pretty explicit about how these things are fixed out. But he knows that the things that are going wrong in his world and the things that are going wrong in his life, whether it's a famine or not, it's ultimately due to sin. At the end of the day, that he sees this as iniquities, and he knows that God is the one who can fix things, right? This is the sins that so easily prevail over David and his people, God easily defeats. He wipes it out. He can so easily defeat the thing that so easily destroys us. And it ends, this little kind of subsection there in verse 4, with a blessing now of God. And again, now we have kind of this, like what Gordon had brought up earlier, this now kind of reversal back into the particular, which is, blesses the one who you choose and bring near to dwell in your courts. We will be satisfied with the goodness of your house, the holiness of your temple. Now that's kind of an interesting statement, because on the one hand, on the surface level, who are the people that God chose to bring into the temple?
Wasn't it the Jews?
Well, sure, the Jews, but even more specifically than that,
Priests.
the priests, right? Is that a hand up, Gordon?
Yeah, this would be hard to answer right at this point, because there wasn't a Jewish temple when
Right.
David wrote this.
Yeah, yeah. And this is one of those.
We do know when the temple was built, if this is looking perhaps prophetically. We know when the temple was built, it was to be a house of prayer for all the nations.
Mhm.
So I don't know that that's what it's referring to. I doubt it.
Yeah, I mean, there's kind of three different possibilities for looking at the question of the temple. One is that the word for temple often is just used for the holy place, the tabernacle. It could be used for that. It can be used for, again, proleptically, as you mentioned, you know, him looking forward to the temple. We know David wants to build the temple. And the other possibility is that this has, like so many of David's Psalms, is that they take David's Psalm, and then when they incorporate it into the hymnal, if we want to use kind of accommodative language, then some parts are updated or added or merged, or the language is adapted in some ways by, you know, like when we read the men of Hezekiah collecting and doing those sorts of things, like what we do with Proverbs. Seems to be the case there with Psalms as well. But yeah, we have the Levites is who we kind of expect to do this. And yet, who have we just seen? It's not just the Levites. It's not even just as Graydon, if I'm pronouncing your name correctly, Mr. Johnson. It's not even just the Jews. He sees everybody as being God drawing them into the courts. It definitely includes the Gentiles. The God who longs for all flesh isn't going to be satisfied with a small subset of a tiny people. But if God has done all these things, as we're going to see, that are universal, then the praise for him needs to be universal as well. Otherwise, it's not going to be fitting in that way. So I think we're going to see this even more clearly in a second in the next verse. But any kind of questions about this kind of opening section where David's saying, look, you fix the things. Ralph, is that a hand up?
Yeah, that's a hand up. I was looking at in verse number 3 where David uses me when he's talking about his iniquities. And then we see our transgressions and we shall be satisfied. Are you saying then that Jew and he's being inclusive with the Gentiles?
I
Or
think
is
so.
there some transition? Okay.
Yeah, and we see this kind of the nation suffering for individual sin actually in the end of 2 Samuel, like in 2 Samuel 24 is the clearest example when he's numbered the people, right? That's David's sin, or depending if you're reading Joab's sin, but regardless, it's very specific sin. But who ends up paying the price for that? It's ultimately the people as part of this problem in that playing out. But yeah, so he sees that this sin is being a bigger problem. And just as God has brought salvation to all of his people, I think he sees it as that salvation spilling out to all people, and not just self. Daryl.
Would you see those iniquities of David and transgressions of all of them as cause for the famine that they're coming out of?
I think so. I mean, I can't be dogmatic about that, but it seems like David is saying, when these things happen because of our sins, you're the one who fixed it. I don't know. What do you think about that? Do you got a different read on how that plays out?
I don't know. It's just as we read it at the beginning, that thought came to my mind.
Yeah, it's a definite. So
It fits.
yeah, it fits. Whether that's for sure, again, you know, I I try to be real careful. What we read in the text, that's the truth. What I insert in there, that's just my attempt to wrestle with it, and I don't want to confuse those two things. But it reads that way to me. I'm certainly open to other possibilities. If anybody else has any thoughts or questions about what we've gone through so far. We just perfectly explained 4 verses. We're crushing it today. All right, so we've got this image in our mind of God's grace just kind of spilling out, not just on David, not just on the Levites, not just on the Jews, but on all people. And if we were kind of uneasy in our minds about that a little bit, this very next section, I think, is going to make it completely obvious. So let's just kind of have this whole section in our minds before we get started. Who wants to read verses 5 through 8 again? I know Daryl did a great job reading it all the first time. Stephen. You are now muted. You were unmuted.
Okay, maybe I muted myself. By awesome deeds you answer us with righteousness, O God of our salvation, and hope of all the ends of the earth and of the farthest seas, the one who by his strength established the mountains, being girded with might, who stills the roaring of the seas, the roaring of their waves, the tumult of the peoples, so that those who dwell at the ends of the earth are in awe at your signs. You made the going out of the morning and the evening to shout for joy.
This is cool, right? If we had wondered at all, if he talks about all people, all flesh, here we can put that to rest, right? He sees God's deeds. We kind of have this as kind of 2 contrasting ideas, right? One having to do with mountains and the other having to do with the sea, right? And these are kind of contrasting ideas. If you look through the Bible, mountains are good things, right? Mountains are the closest you can get to God in a lot of ways. If you look at, for example, in the ancient Near East, the Babylonian and the Assyrian temples, the Sumerian temples, the ziggurats, what are they shaped like? They're mountains, right? And on the top of there, that's where you put your temple. If you read in Ezekiel, then Eden isn't just a garden. It's a garden that's on top of take a guess.
Mountain.
It's on top of a mountain because of course it is, right? That's where their God's going to, and of course, where's the temple placed?
Mountain.
On a mountain.
Mount
We just
Zion.
saw it, right? Mount Zion. Hey, where did the people meet with God in the wilderness? On a mountain, right? Of course it was. That's what they expect. That's what you're going to see, Mount Sinai. And these are so important that the name of the mountain is often synonymous with the people. Yeah, Richard.
I think John had something, John Trigg.
Oh, I'm sorry, John. Did I completely ignore you?
Yeah, I was just going to add that the mountains are called upon to be witnesses of the covenant as well.
Yes, they are. And where are they when they're shouting the blessings and the curses? They're on top of? Yeah, at this point, we all know the answer, right? Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim. Yeah, exactly right. When they had that giant altar actually on top of what's probably Mount Ebal.
Yeah, and you had the heights of Gibeon. You had the heights of Gibeon where Solomon was inquiring of the Lord and had his dream and asked for wisdom. And all the time shrines and temples, etc., were on high places, mountains.
Yep. So what we have there is exactly right. Stephen's high places. And now, of course, those are bad ways to do it. But even if they're not acceptable, right, places to worship, as Deuteronomy would be very emphatic for us to know, that's what they thought. And here, though, we have who made the mountains?
Jesus.
God did.
Yeah.
Of course,
Yeah.
God did.
Now, we all know the answer to that, right? Like, you're like, so do my, kids, or some of you, grandkids, and some of y'all just look old, like John Trigg. But John, are they going to make you play Santa Claus again this year?
I don't think I'll get that opportunity because of current situation. But
You started this whole thing to get out of playing Santa Claus. I see how it goes. But here again, if we think like they do at first, and certainly the normal people, that God just lives on top of a mountain, well, then God's smaller than the mountain. And yet here we have the Lord. He's created All the mountains. You know, and again, where's the temple? It's on top of a mountain. But God is not just the God of Mount Zion. God is not just the God of Israel. God is the God of what? We've just seen. All flesh. And that means any mountain that you go to, you know whose mountain that really is? It's not Baal's. It's not, Marduk's. It's not Moat's. It's the Lord's. He's the one who established the mountains. He's girded with might. They're like his belt, is how Job describes it one time. But it's not just the mountains. If you want to look at another kind of universally applied geographical feature in the Bible, and it's kind of funny, if you pay attention to these sorts of things, which a lot of times we don't, but if you pay attention to geography, they're almost always used in specific ways, right? Like, so mountains are always where you're going to go and meet God and have those sorts of worship sites. And so if you go up to a mountain, that's what's going to happen. Hey, what happens when Jesus and, 3 of his buddies go up on a mountain? Same thing. We expect that to happen. Wilderness is another thing, right? You know what happens in the wilderness? You're tested and you are found wanting when you're tempted. Happens every time, except, of course, when Jesus does it. That's kind of a subversion of that expectation, right? But here we have this other one, and that is the sea. Now, I did some of the legwork for you guys on mountains, but just kind of run through the biblical stories, and let's think of how are the seas portrayed in the Old Testament and in the New, both.
Stormy.
What was that, Kathleen?
Stormy.
Stormy. Yeah, not just stormy. What else?
Did we say they stand? Go ahead.
I think that was right. I heard like 4 different people shout out what I assume is the right answer. Phil, what was that?
Danger in the abyss.
Yeah, danger in the abyss. Chaos, right? And where's the first story we see this in the Bible?
Genesis 1.
Genesis 1, right? I love, this is one of my favorite Hebrew phrases. It's tohu vavohu. Like, you don't even have to know Hebrew to say, oh, that sounds pretty cool. And that's this chaotic waters that are raging before God brings order to chaos. And if you read through Genesis 1, it's not as obvious there, but if you read in Job, or if you read in the Psalms, or if you read in any other ancient Near Eastern creation myth, then what does God, or the gods, the ancient Near Eastern versions of these, have to do before they can create the world? They have to defeat the scary sea every single time, right? And even if we move kind of westward in the Mediterranean to the Greeks or the Romans, the craziest, wildest, most insane god is always the god of the ocean. And that makes sense because imagine being a poor sailor in the ancient world and a storm hits you. There's nothing you can do.
You
right?
might have Jonah on board.
You might have Jonah on board. Throw him overboard, right? Stinking prophet anyway. But you know who did that. And there's nothing you can do about it. Remember, when Paul's in there, like they've rowed their hearts out, didn't do a thing, right? And the thing we think about crazy is it's even worse. Almost nobody in the ancient world could swim, even the sailors. So if you got hit by a storm, you were dead. And all the time, and it's explicit, like in Job, God, fishes up Yam and Tiamat, the sea gods, up with a fish hook, right? Just kind of fillets them up real nice. It's no big deal. And here God too, he stills the roaring waves. Nothing can still the roaring waves, of course, except God, peace be still. Who is this that even the winds and waves obey him? Because everybody knows the answer to that. The only one who can do that is God. Yeah, Ken. You are muted. Sorry.
I was just saying, I've got to run. I just got interrupted. I've got to address a need here. So we'll see you guys later. Enjoyed it. Thanks for everything.
Good putting a face to the name.
Sarah, I'll add my regards.
I will.
So we have this, and if you think about mountains, you think about waters, and that's the whole Kit Kat and caboodle, right? And how does he describe in verse 5 and then in verse 8, how far is God really God? Until where?
To the ends of the earth.
The ends of the earth. Exactly right. Now, this probably is echoing, giving us an echo in our minds from a passage in Acts that we know pretty well. Remember in Acts chapter 2, when, you know, they, you know, we know the passage, right? And the people ask what's going on. And Peter tells them, who's this promise for? It's for you, and it's for,
As many as the Lord shall call.
yeah, to the ends of the earth, or, right, as far as those things go. Well, wait a second. Those whom the Lord shall call certainly sounds like what we read about there in verse 4, doesn't it? Those whom the Lord will choose to bring near. Hey, wait a second. Where does Acts chapter 2 happen on top of?
Mountain.
A mountain, right? You're like, of course it does at this point. No surprises at all. But we have then this idea that by your awesome deeds, you answer us in righteousness, O God of our salvation, not just the hope of David, not just the hope of Israel, but the hope of people and the salvation of people as far as the ends of the earth and the farthest seas. Now that's pretty incredible. And this kind of leads into these ideas, of course. This is one of the reasons the Psalms are the most quoted book in the New Testament, is because the Psalms often see this universalizing principle. Of course, you know, the Jews knew this in the first century. The problem is that they thought that meant everybody had to become Jews before they could be saved. And Jesus is like, no, that's not what's going on here. And David seems to have a glimpse of how that plays out in this discussion as well. And that kind of ends where we look, and probably it's even further there, that very last line there in verse 8. Your versions may read a little bit differently, but the ESV says, you make the going out of the morning and the evening shout for joy. This is probably an image of the sun going across the world, that everything the sun sees, that's the ends of the world. Well, that's what God has as well, is that the God is a God of all peoples, and he's going to call all peoples to him, and he's going to meet all peoples at a mountain, and he's going to not let the seas be a bar to his choosing, right? And so we have those sorts of discussions going on, and remember, all this is David being thankful, is that he sees what God has done for him, and he says, you know what? It's not just me for you've done this for. It's not just my people. You've actually done this for everybody. That is a pretty incredible thing. When we look at our own salvation, when we what's been done for us and think, this is how great God is, everybody needs to praise him. That our gratitude should aim us towards his greatness, rather than just being, look what happened to me. Look how good everything's going for me. But I think that we can see that in those ends of the earth and how that plays out. And it's going to kind of transition then into this next section. But before we left there, I want to make sure that there was no questions or comments that you guys had. Stephen, again.
So one thing that I think ties this a little bit together for me is John 1:10, where it says, he was in the world and the world was made through him, yet the world did not know him. And so we know that creation was through Jesus. And so you see in verse 6 where he established the mountains, that the world was created through Jesus. And we see who atoned for our transgressions, and back in 3, and who stills the roaring of the seas. On the Sea of Galilee, we see Jesus. We see him so much in here with just the way some of the things are phrased. And so I think it's very prophetic about Jesus and the second covenant.
Absolutely. Yes, sir.
I'm reading here at verse 6 from the New Revised Standard Version. And the language there is that the gateways of the morning and the evening shout for joy. If we take that language rather than the idea of your goings forth are, then what would be the meaning of the gateways there? What would be the significance of it?
Yeah, so sorry, in verse 8, right? Or is that, I was just making sure I was on the right verse there.
Yeah, it would be 8.
Okay.
Yeah, verse 8, I'm sorry.
No. That you're fine. I just wanted to make sure I was answering your question correctly. So this idea of gateways it's again one of these strange, exactly how to do that. Dwelling places or gateways. How the rest of y'all's versions deal with that there in verse 8.
Outgoing.
Going, some people's, gateways, others for the new NRSV.
The first half of verse 8.
Yes.
They who dwell in the ends of the earth and stand in awe of your signs.
Okay. Yeah. So probably I hesitate to say for sure what's going on, because I've not looked specifically into this. I would guess what's playing out is in Hebrew the dwellings or the going outs is yashveh, and I'm guessing there's probably a textual variant that says which swap the bet and the shin to say yashav, which would be where we get gates out of there. I'm not certain of that. Don't hold me to that. I can look into that and let you know. Stephen, what do you got?
So when you say gateway, I'm thinking of the gates of the city. And in the morning, you would go out of the gates of the city to work in the fields. And then the evening, you would come back in through the gates at the end of the day to spend your time. And to me, you can maybe look at it that way, is that the sun rising and the sun setting, you're also going out of the gates and then coming back into the gates, into the city at the end of the day.
Yeah, certainly we see a lot of sun imagery tied to the gate. So for example, when Boaz is getting all the elders together to witness him, taking the sandal and everything to the man whose sandal's taken off, that occurs as the sun is rising. They go to the gate. So Richard, I think maybe had to end up, and then Gordon.
Yeah, I just wanted to suggest, since we're running a little short on time, that maybe we save further comments on this and maybe come back to it at the end so that we get a chance to finish these beautiful verses that close out the psalm.
Yes.
Sure. So he cut you off, Gordon. You can blame Richard, the tyrant, in the top left corner of my screen. So we have this last section, and kind of doing the same thing. Who wants to read verses 9 through 13 for me, just so we can have this section at all in our heads?
You visit the earth and cause it to overflow. You greatly enrich it. The stream of God is full of water, and you prepare the grain, for thus you prepare the earth. You water its furrows abundantly. You settle its ridges. You soften it with showers. You bless its growth. You have crowned the year with your bounty, and your paths drip with fatness. The passengers of the wilderness drip, and the hills gird themselves with rejoicing. The meadows are clothed with flax, and the valleys are covered with grain. They shout for joy. Yes, they sing.
So here we have these images that definitely lead to this idea of this abundant, verdant, all the different adjectives you want to play out in terms of how that the wilderness that is so drab and sparsely clad has, as one person said, has become meadows thick with grass and flowers after the rain. And here, this image, a lot of times, I don't know if any of you guys have gotten the opportunity to go to the Holy Land or go to Israel or Palestine. When they go in the tourist season, it's during the dry season. And we kind of have this whole idea of it being wilderness and desert. But if you kind of go up to the north, like Dan, then you get a little bit better of an idea. But if you went during the rainy season, like Stephen would talk about with California, then it just explodes. It's like, I don't know, Arizona or something after a rainstorm has come and everything just blooms. And here, this temporary, local blooming is for David, and should be for all the people, a source of eternal joy. The God's blessings has resolved everything that is wrong, that everything is playing out here. And we have kind of this personalization of these meadows and the valleys and all these other areas that they're kind of personified. And God has provided them everything they needed. And what's kind of this conclusion there at the end? We're going to work backwards from the conclusion. What's going to happen when all these things have been provided for?
Shout and sing.
They shout and sing, right? And who's shouting and singing here, Ralph?
Everybody, all people, all flesh.
Right. But here it's even cooler because it's specific. You're exactly right. By the way.
Flowers and the meadows.
It's the meadows and the
Sure.
valleys and the mountains. And now those things don't really sing, right? Like we know how that plays out. But if God has provided valleys and flowers and mountains with what they need, who's he really provided what they need?
People.
Yeah, the people. So if they're willing to rejoice and shout for joy and to praise God, how much more so should we? That's how this kind of concludes. And again, we're going to work backwards there for a second. But if God has provided everything, and notice it's even here there in verse 9, the last section, you've already prepared it. Well, God didn't do these things for the land itself, right? Think, again, we've already got creation imagery in our heads, okay? When is man created? Not until when?
Sixth day.
Yeah, sixth day. Why did God prepare everything else first?
For man.
For man, right? And notice he'd already prepared it. This preparing it is indeed a particular, it's the same thing that he's done with establishing the mountains. It's going to be the same thing that we see, of course, throughout the New Testament. I mean, and I imagine some of you guys have got these verses memorized. Ephesians chapter 1, verse 4, now we're, thinking about creation. Before the foundations of the world, right? He'd already prepared that we should be holy and without blame with him forever. Or 2 Timothy chapter 1, verses 8 through 9, sharing the suffering of the gospel by the power of God who saved us and called us to his holy calling, not because of our works, but because of his own purpose and grace, which he gave us in Christ Jesus before what? Anybody want to finish that verse for me? You probably know it. Yeah, before the world began. The same thing. 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 19 and 20. God made provision for our redemption through Christ before the creation of the world. Or Revelation 13:8, the lamb slain from the foundation of the world. Now, clearly Jesus hadn't been slain right before the foundation of the world. We know that means, but God has already prepared it. He already purposed it. He already done these things. And if here the very inanimate valleys and flowers and all these other things have praised God, what does it end with this resounding implication? Those things are actually all for us. And we had better praise him as well. Remember when Jesus is coming in for the triumphal entry, and people are shouting and praising him, and the people are like, hey, shut up these people, don't let them praise you. And Jesus says, look, if these were silent, what would happen? Anybody remember this? Yeah.
Stones would cry out.
Yeah. Carolyn or Caroline, I'm not sure which it is, but she said that the rocks would cry out. Well, here God's creation is crying out. And it ends with this again, are we going to join as part of God's creation, as the crown, right? The crown of God's creation in praising God and thanks of what he's actually done, not just for the world, but for us. And that everything that leads up to this, the creation, the redemption, the grace that he provides, the food, all good and perfect gifts come from him. They've all been for us. And yet we're the ones who are ungrateful. We're the ones who are selfish. We're the ones who at the end of the day, like, praise God, maybe tomorrow. I'm hungry, I'm thirsty, I'm tired, my toe itches. And that seems to be kind of the implication that David says, I'm not going to be like that. I've seen what God has done. He's answered my prayers. What I have vowed, I will pay. So I wanted to make sure we were wrapping up right at 9 for Richard, but we can stay around and chat about specific things. But I didn't know if there was a closing mechanism or anything else like that. So I'm going to turn it back over to Richard.
Well, I just want to say amen. That's and it turns out it was the perfect Thanksgiving psalm, and I wish I had thought of that when I selected it, but I didn't have that foresight. Yeah, I want to just express my appreciation to you, and I'm going to stop the recording